47 seconds. That's how long J.D. Vance sat in complete silence. No rebuttal, no reaction. Just a calm stare across the table, while a federal judge, with cameras rolling, tried to rip him apart on national television. But in those 47 seconds, something shifted. The tension in the room cracked, and when J.D. finally spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He simply reached into a black folder, pulled out 3 pages, and changed the next 30 years of one man's career. By the time he finished reading, the judge's hands were trembling. The audience, frozen, and the control room, silent. What was inside that folder? And why did a man who built his power on fear start to fall the moment someone chose to stay quiet? Because sometimes silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. While this story is a work of imagination, its echoes are real. The emotions, the tensions, the questions it stirs, they come from truths we all feel, even if the scene never quite happened this way. In a world where power often speaks the loudest, this is a reflection of what it might look like when quiet courage speaks back. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The lobby was too quiet for a national broadcast. J.D. Vance stepped through the sliding glass doors of the D.C. studio just after 4 p.m., wearing a plain navy suit and a calm he'd rehearsed all morning. The air smelled like cold coffee and new carpet. The receptionist didn't look up. No intern came to greet him. No producer waved from the hallway. He checked his watch. They had confirmed the time twice. Still, no one. The studio halls, usually humming with last-minute script checks and frantic headset chatter, now sounded like a museum. Just the soft hum of the overhead lights, buzzing like fluorescent judgment. A voice echoed faintly from the wall-mounted TV in the lobby. A teaser reel. Coming up next, can a populace survive in the court of law? J.D. Vance joins us live. Unfiltered, unscripted, unprotected. Unprotected? J.D. raised an eyebrow. That wasn't in the agreed-upon teaser. He felt a flicker, like the first static charge before a storm. He moved toward the makeup bay. Empty. The chair sat askew, a clean brush tray untouched on the counter. The usual small-talk stylists were nowhere. No powder, no mic pack, no pre-interview warm-up. Just silence. Intentional silence. At the far end of the hall, the green room door was closed, but not locked. Inside, no bottled water, no host clipboard. Only a single screen playing a clip on loop. J.D.'s most contentious Senate speech from last fall. The one where he'd said, "Power doesn't always wear a black robe. Sometimes it wears a smile and a contract." He hadn't seen that clip in months. Now it filled the screen like a warning. This wasn't an interview, it was a setup. And not just for ratings, for something else. Something more personal. From a speaker overhead, a producer's voice crackled. "Senator Vance, please make your way to Studio B. We're live in 4. He stepped into the corridor. The lights felt hotter here. Brighter. Too bright for comfort, not bright enough for truth. As he passed a sound tech crouched by the wall, he offered a small nod. The tech looked away. Quickly. It was subtle, but J.D. had learned to read the small betrayals. Averted eyes, stiff posture, the absence of normal protocol. This wasn't just stagecraft. It was an ambush with good lighting. Outside the studio door, he paused. Through the glass, he could see the host already seated under the warm glow of spotlights. Polished desk, multiple camera angles. A judge, yes, a real federal judge, was seated opposite the host, flipping slowly through a folder of documents as if rehearsing his lines. J.D.'s own chair sat alone. No mic clipped, no water glass, just a vacant seat in the center. He let out a slow breath. They hadn't invited him for a conversation. They'd invited him for a conviction. One without a jury, one that would be played on loop by morning. And yet, he pushed open the door. Because some rooms weren't meant to be fair. They were meant to be watched. When J.D. stepped into the studio, the air dropped 10 degrees. Across from him, under lights set too warm for comfort, sat Judge Milton Graves, 30 years on the federal bench, and not a single ruling reversed on appeal. His reputation was ironclad. He was the kind of man who didn't just speak law, he wore it like armor. His eyes didn't move when J.D. entered. They didn't need to. He had already calculated everything that might be said. and everything that wouldn't. Graves's face looked sculpted in stone. Sharp cheekbones, iron-set jaw, lips drawn so tightly they looked like a sealed envelope. His hands rested neatly on a tan folder. Nothing flashy, just the right shade of institutional beige. A folder that meant something was coming. JD took his seat slowly, never breaking eye contact. No microphone. Still, no pleasantries. Still. The host cleared his throat from behind the polished desk. "We're live in 30 seconds. No one replied. Graves leaned back. He didn't blink. There was no welcome, no handshake, no courtroom decorum, only presence, the kind that made even confident men second-guess their choices. JD knew that presence well. He'd seen it in committee hearings, in war rooms, in the quiet fury of a corporate boardroom just before a proxy vote turned bloody. But here, on live television, it took on a different weight. There would be no transcripts to revise, no objections to sustain, just millions of eyes, and an agenda sharp enough to draw blood before the first commercial break. This wasn't a panel. It was a precision strike. The producer's voice rang in their ears. "Camera one rolling, in 3, 2. The host smiled into the lens. "Tonight we have a very special segment, a sitting senator and a sitting judge, face to face, no spin, no prep, just truth." Graves didn't smile. JD didn't move. The host turned slightly. "Senator Vance, thank you for being here." JD gave a quiet nod. "Judge Graves, a pleasure as always." No response. Then the host's eyes twitched, just enough to signal the shift. "We begin tonight with a simple question," he said, looking directly at JD. "Senator, last year you called the judiciary, and I quote, a machine built to remember laws but forget people. Would you say that to Judge Graves now, face to face?" JD didn't answer. Not yet. He glanced at Graves. The judge slowly opened the beige folder. 1 page, 2, 3. He laid them flat on the desk like playing cards. Then finally he spoke, his voice like sanded wood. "I've ruled on over 8,000 cases, Senator. Never once has a defendant accused me of forgetting their name. But I've seen politicians forget entire cities." JD sat still. The host jumped in. "Is that a challenge?" Graves didn't move. "It's a record." The room went quiet again. Not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence that happens when a trap has already been sprung, and all that's left is to wait for the fall. JD didn't flinch, because he knew something the judge didn't. Records can be precise, but they can also be incomplete, and sometimes the name you forget is the one that changes everything. The table was glass, clear, polished, without scratches. It gleamed under the studio lights like a courtroom exhibit, as if even the furniture had been chosen to expose, not protect. The cameras were positioned not at eye level, but slightly below, tilted upward, an angle used not to flatter, but to intensify. It made the judge look larger than life. It made JD look like the one being judged. This wasn't a talk show. It was a trial stage for the screen. And the host? JD hadn't forgotten who he was. Darren Cole, former media advisor to JD's fiercest political rival in the 2022 Senate race. The man who once edited a campaign ad to make JD's voice seem like it cracked during a debate. The same Darren who now smiled into the camera with his signature blend of ease and edge. Tonight he wasn't just a moderator, he was the architect. Every pause was planned, every line rehearsed, every cutaway angle programmed in advance to catch JD blinking, frowning, or hesitating. It was less interview and more entrapment, wrapped in a velvet voiceover and a $3,000 sport coat. JD knew the playbook. He just hadn't expected them to use it here. Not this openly, not with a federal judge in the chair across from him, and millions of viewers tuned in to watch what they thought would be another clean takedown of a so-called populist politician. But then, JD did something no one expected. He didn't lean forward. He didn't defend his record. He didn't offer a soundbite. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a black folder, and placed it gently, deliberately, on the table between them. The camera panned in. No logo, no seal, just a matte finish. The kind you find in evidence rooms and quiet archives. JD didn't open it. Not yet. Darren blinked. It was the first thing unscripted all evening. "What's that?" he asked, tone still casual, but with a thread of strain. JD looked him in the eye. Perspective. Judge Graves shifted slightly in his seat, barely noticeable, but to JD, it was everything. Even the most immovable men react to surprise. Not fear, just calculation. And tonight, the judge was recalculating. JD rested his hands on the glass table. "I didn't come to debate you," he said calmly. "I came to finish a conversation your courtroom never allowed." The host tilted his head. "Excuse me?" JD tapped the folder once, lightly. "These are testimonies. 3 families. All veterans. All denied hearings in the Southern District over the last 2 years. Not because they lacked evidence, but because their filing dates fell on holidays, and your courtroom closed its doors." Graves didn't speak, but his jaw stiffened. Not denial, delay. JD continued, voice still even. "I brought their names, their letters. One of them addressed you directly. You returned it unopened." Darren leaned forward now, visibly uncertain. "Senator, with all due respect, this isn't a court of law." JD looked straight into the camera. "No," he said, "but maybe it's the only place left where someone will listen." The room was still, and for the first time, it wasn't because of tension. It was because something had shifted. This wasn't the story they thought they were filming. This was the one they'd been trying to avoid. And JD, he wasn't here to survive the trap. He was here to name it. Judge Graves had waited for this moment, not for days, but years. The rise of men like J.D. Vance had, in his mind, signaled a corrosion in the institution he had devoted his life to protecting. To Graves, populism wasn't a philosophy. It was a threat dressed in charisma. And tonight, he intended to make an example of it. He didn't waste time. "No offense, Senator," the judge said, turning just slightly in his seat. "But how can Americans trust you when your own party barely does?" The words were delivered with the grace of a surgeon and the force of a guillotine. There was no anger in them, only precision. Graves didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean in. He knew better. He'd tried men with murder charges and CEOs with armies of lawyers. He understood something most people forgot. A calm accusation cuts deeper. Darren, the host, smiled slightly. This was the line they'd rehearsed, the one meant to rattle JD out of whatever speech he thought he was going to give. They expected protest, pushback, a flinch. But JD didn't blink. He didn't even shift in his seat. Instead, he did nothing. Nothing at all. Not a smirk. Not a rebuttal. Just one long, deliberate pause. The kind that rewires a room. And for the first time, it was Judge Graves who noticed the sound of his own breath. JD's eyes met his. No condescension, no nerves. Just a stare that said, "I heard you, and I'm not impressed." That silence dragged. 5 seconds. Then 10. Darren fidgeted with his cue cards. Graves narrowed his eyes. JD finally spoke, but not in defense. Not about his party, not about polls, not even about himself. He simply asked, "Do you know their names?" The question was low, level, almost like a whisper, yet it sliced through the lights and cameras like a blade through silk. Graves frowned. "Whose names?" JD gently lifted the black folder again, flipped it open, and pulled out the first sheet of paper. A letter, handwritten, ink smudged in one corner. He read, "My son came home with more medals than memories. When he applied for disability, he was told to come back in 6 months. He didn't make it 6 weeks." JD set the page down. "Her name," he said quietly, "was Olivia Pierce. The VA said no. She came to your courtroom next. The filing was 1 day late because she buried her son the day before." Graves remained still. JD didn't look for sympathy. He wasn't baiting emotion. He wasn't reaching for applause. He was naming what had been erased. "You ask how people can trust me?" JD continued. "I ask how they're supposed to trust anyone, when showing up late to paperwork means they never get heard at all." Another silence, this one heavier. Graves opened his mouth to respond, but Darren jumped in, almost too quickly. "We all know courts follow rules, Senator. Surely you're not suggesting..." JD cut him off with a look. Not sharp, just steady. I'm suggesting that when systems forget people, rules become excuses. He leaned back. No outrage, no performance, just truth. And that, in the space of a single minute, had already done more damage than any outburst ever could. The strike had been planned, scripted, delivered, but it never landed, because JD hadn't shown up to fight. He'd shown up to make silence louder than shame. The silence didn't end after JD spoke. It deepened. It pressed into the corners of the studio like mist, settling in the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the gentle whir of camera lenses adjusting. Something had changed, and everyone in the room felt it. The crew, once focused on audio levels and cue lights, stopped moving. No one dared whisper. Even Darren, ever the conductor of televised rhythm, leaned back, letting a beat hang longer than broadcast timing allowed. JD didn't move fast. He reached slowly for the black folder again, but instead of opening it, he let his hand rest on its surface, as if the weight of what was inside didn't need revealing just yet. Not because it wasn't time, but because the silence had become its own form of evidence. Then calmly, JD said one sentence. Let's talk about your rulings in 2021. Northwell Finance. The name struck like a hidden wire under shallow water. Judge Graves stiffened, almost imperceptibly, but not imperceptibly enough. His eyes twitched. Just for a second. But for someone who'd built a 3-decade career on being unreadable, a second was a landslide. I believe, JD continued, his tone deceptively conversational, you ruled in favor of Northwell after they seized 42 homes in Carroll County. Many of them belonged to veterans who defaulted after their pensions were delayed. Graves' voice cut back, low and firm. That case followed federal lien statute. The court had no discretion in... You had discretion in which arguments to hear, JD interrupted. You dismissed their counsel in under 6 minutes. JD leaned forward, his voice still calm. But now it carried something colder beneath the warmth. Not anger, not accusation, just clarity. One of those men, JD said, tapping the table, died in his truck after being evicted. The home had been in his family for 3 generations. He paused again. Not for drama, just to let the air catch up. I read your statement, he added. You said, quote, the law must be upheld, even when its outcomes feel regrettable. Graves opened his mouth, then closed it. JD didn't press. He didn't gloat. He simply let the record speak. You've never lost a ruling, JD said, but how many people lost everything because of them? The line was gentle, devastating in its stillness. Darren glanced toward the control booth, then quickly back. The producers were frozen, not out of confusion, but because they sensed something rare, a moment escaping their grip. You brought me here to ask whether I can be trusted, JD said. That's fair, but I didn't come to be measured by the scoreboard of party loyalty. He turned slightly toward the camera, not breaking the fourth wall, but brushing it just enough. I came to ask why we trust outcomes that serve systems over lives. For a second, Judge Graves looked older, not weak, just weary, as if the burden of reputation had started to pull heavier on his posture than his robe ever did in court. JD didn't push further. He let silence return. Not awkward, not empty, just full. And in that quiet, something happened no one planned. The audience didn't lean back. They leaned in. Because the loudest thing in the room wasn't JD's voice. It was the sound of a reputation being held to the light, and the unmistakable echo of truth finally being heard. The lights seemed to shift, though no one touched a thing. The cameras adjusted their angles with eerie precision, creeping closer to JD's face, then to the black folder resting between his hands. The folder hadn't moved, hadn't even been cracked open, and yet it dominated the room like a gavel waiting to fall. Judge Graves straightened his back, ever so slightly. The veteran of over 800 rulings, he had seen men crumble in courtrooms colder than this studio. But even he could feel it now. The shift. The studio no longer felt like a stage. It felt like testimony. JD's fingers lightly tapped the folder's edge. Not to build drama, but as if to remind everyone. This isn't theater. This is record. The host, Darren, tried to jump in. tried to redirect, reframe, reassert control. "Senator Vance," he said, voice brittle with forced calm, "we want to respect your views, but if we're going to litigate the entire judicial system here." JD looked up, not at Darren, not even at Graves, but at the camera. And then, with a voice so even it almost sounded rehearsed, he said, "Northwell was just one case. I brought 10. The room stopped breathing. JD didn't open the folder. He didn't need to. "The names in this folder aren't headlines," he continued. "They're not fundraisers. They're not partisan leverage. They're parents who buried children, veterans who lost homes, single mothers whose restraining orders were denied until it was too late." Graves shifted again, but slower this time. Less resistance, more weight. JD went on, surgical now, not with fury, but with facts sharpened by intention. "Do you remember case 22-411, Washington State?" he asked quietly. "A woman named Elisa Ward filed a suit against the chemical company that poisoned her town's water supply. You dismissed it on procedural grounds. Improper jurisdiction." JD's gaze was steady. 2 months later, 3 more kids were diagnosed with the same leukemia her daughter died from. Graves tried to reply. "The case was refiled and denied again," JD finished, not raising his voice, "because the statute had run out." His finger tapped once against the folder. "I'm not questioning your legal knowledge, Your Honor. I'm questioning what happens when law is used as armor against listening." Darren looked off camera, mouthing something. Producers moved, uncertain. JD finally placed both hands flat on the folder, still unopened. "You invited me here to explain myself to the American people," he said. "But maybe it's time someone asked why their suffering has to be airtight in formatting to be worth your time." The sentence lingered. It didn't shout. It whispered, right to the moral center of the viewer. Even the teleprompter operator had stopped scrolling. Graves stared at the folder, not in fear, but with something closer to fatigue. Not because he didn't know what was inside, but because deep down he did. JD leaned back. Still, he didn't open it, because he didn't need paper to make the point. He had already turned the studio into a courtroom, but more importantly, he had turned the audience into a jury. And the weight of the folder? It wasn't what was inside, it was what it reminded them all. That some truths don't need to be screamed to leave a mark. Some just sit there, unopened, and accuse the silence. Judge Graves scoffed. It was subtle, just a quiet exhale laced with disdain. But in the vacuum of tension that had filled the room, it might as well have been a gavel slam to disrupt the silence. "Pure speculation," he said, adjusting his cufflinks like they were a shield. "This is beneath you, Senator." JD didn't flinch. He had heard the same phrase hurled at whistleblowers, veterans, and teachers who challenged power. He simply opened the folder. No flourish, no drama, just the soft, precise slide of a man turning over a page he had waited years to show the world. Page 1, a scanned wire transfer, $380,000 from a holding account tied to Northwell Finance. Destination, a trust fund in Atlanta, administered by a firm whose name appeared, circled in red ink. JD tapped that name with his index finger. Graves and Connolly Legal Trust. It wasn't Graves' name on the account, it was his nephew's. Graves blinked, not wide, not twice, just once. But the camera caught it, and so did Darren. JD didn't say a word. He slid the document toward the center of the table. "I'm not here to accuse," he said. "I'm here to connect dots the public was never given." Graves leaned forward, forced a dry laugh. "This is guilt by association. My nephew's affairs are independent of your courtroom rulings?" JD's voice was gentle. "Then explain why the trust received deposits within 48 hours of each judgment favoring Northwell." He flipped the second page. More transfers. Different dates. But the pattern held. Darren tried to cut in. "We don't know if this was intentional." "That's the thing," JD said, glancing at the host. "We don't know. Because the decisions that affect people's homes and lives, our people's futures, are being made in rooms where accountability is considered a threat." Graves's jaw tightened. "I've served under 5 administrations," the judge said stiffly. "You think some pop politics accusation can undermine that?" JD didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a third document, a letter, sealed, notarized, written by a whistleblower from Northwell's legal team. The letter alleged internal concerns about preferential treatment by a federal judge in exchange for silence regarding familial financial ties. It was dated 2 years ago. JD placed it gently on the glass. "I never said you took money, Judge," JD said, voice quiet. "But I think the people watching deserve to know why so many things around you seem to benefit when the powerless lost." Silence returned, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was sharp, slicing through illusion. Graves adjusted in his seat. His legendary stillness, the posture that had cowed attorneys, rattled prosecutors, and intimidated journalists, was starting to break. Not fall, just crack. The camera didn't blink. JD leaned back, not smug, not triumphant, just settled. "Truth isn't always clean," he said. "Sometimes it comes folded, quiet, carried by the ones who weren't supposed to speak at all." Behind the cameras, a producer muttered, "We just went viral." Darren stared at the table like he could will the papers to vanish. And Graves? He looked at the folder, then at the camera, and for the first time in 30 years, he didn't know what to say. JD didn't gloat, he didn't gesture. He simply turned to the next page. The motion was slow, deliberate. The kind you make when you know what's coming is heavier than the paper it's printed on. Page 2 wasn't a whistleblower letter. It wasn't a money transfer. It was a memo. Clean, formal, cold. The top read, "Internal Legal Analysis, Northwell Finance v. Hillridge Co-op." The date, March 3rd, 2021. The sender, Ellis and Graves, LLP. The recipient, Northwell Finance Legal Counsel. And in the third paragraph, highlighted in soft gray, it read, "Consultation services provided under the direction of Senior Partner Emeritus Graves, per pre-agreement terms dated Q1. There it was. Graves's old firm, still bearing his name, had billed Northwell for legal consultation on the same case he would later rule on in court. JD didn't push the paper forward this time. He didn't have to. The camera crew zoomed in without cue. Even Darren leaned closer, brow furrowed. Graves sat still, not the stillness of command, but of calculation, like a man running mental triage on a house that had already caught fire. JD looked at him, not with accusation, but inquiry. "You ruled in their favor, Judge," he said. "Your firm profited. Want to keep going?" Graves opened his mouth to speak, but JD continued. "I'm not asking for an apology. I'm asking what part of this the American people were supposed to believe was fair." He flipped the page again. New document. New date. This one was a billing summary. JD tapped a line item near the bottom. Policy Influence Consultation. 8 hours billed at $1,250 per hour. "That's $10,000, JD said, "in one day, while the case was under judicial consideration." The studio no longer felt like a set. It felt like deposition under floodlights. Graves's face didn't flinch this time. It hardened. But the subtle panic had crept in, not in his expression, but in his breath. The tight inhale he tried to hide, the brief dart of his eyes toward the control room. Darren cleared his throat. "We should probably remind viewers that this is..." JD cut in. "I already said it before. This isn't about proving guilt. It's about asking why these patterns never saw the light of day." He looked into the camera. "I'm here for every American who ever walked into a courtroom and felt the outcome was decided before they opened their mouth." The words didn't need anger. They needed only to be true. And in that moment, they were undeniable. The director whispered into his headset, "Twitter's already trending. #2 worldwide." The producer answered, "What's #1? The director paused, then grinned, #Gravesgate. Meanwhile, JD flipped the folder shut, not to end the conversation, but to remind them that there was more. Much more. But he didn't need to show it all now, because the second document had already said more than any speech could. And Judge Milton Graves, for the first time, the gavel of perception had turned against him. He looked smaller now, not in stature, but in story. There was no gavel, no bailiff, no stained oak walls. Yet somehow the studio no longer felt like a set. It felt like a courtroom. Except this time, the audience wasn't sitting in pews behind a bar. They were holding phones, seated at kitchen tables, riding buses, watching from break rooms across America. And the case wasn't state v. citizen. It was truth versus power. The hashtag appeared in the corner of the screen without fanfare. Hashtag truth underlights. And within minutes, it was trending, not just in D.C., but nationwide. Judge Graves sat straighter now, the rigid posture of a man trained to project command, but whose grip was slipping. His fingers were interlaced too tightly. His jaw, once still, ticked faintly. But it was his eyes that betrayed him. They were moving too fast, not scanning for a counter-argument, scanning for an exit. J.D. didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply leaned forward, voice steady. "Do you know why this moment matters, Judge?" Graves didn't answer. J.D. gestured to the cameras. "Because for once, the room isn't closed. The transcripts aren't buried. The rulings aren't locked behind clerks and marble walls. They're open. They're lit. And the people are watching." A pause. J.D. let the words settle. "I'm not trying to end your career. That's not my job. I'm trying to start a conversation America should have had a decade ago." Darren, the host, glanced at the control booth. No cues, no time checks. They knew better now than to interrupt. Graves opened his mouth. "I've always acted within the ethical parameters of my office," he said, tone clipped. "This is a media ambush." But the words felt outdated, like a rotary phone in a digital age. J.D. replied calmly, "The question isn't whether you followed the rules. It's whether you wrote them to protect yourself." A beat. The lights above hummed quietly. Even the camera operators held still. Then J.D. added almost softly, "Sometimes justice isn't broken. It's just quiet. And the people you silence the longest are usually the ones you fear hearing from most." That line didn't trend. It exploded. Screens lit up in homes from Scranton to San Diego. Clips went viral before the show had even ended. The quote was already being stitched into TikToks, stitched into history. And Graves? He blinked again. Not from fatigue, but because in that moment, the line between judge and defendant had vanished. Not legally, but emotionally. And everyone watching could feel it. J.D. leaned back. "This isn't about me. It never was. It's about every vet denied a claim, every family steamrolled by a verdict they couldn't afford to challenge. This," he tapped the glass table gently, "is what happens when you finally bring the courtroom into the light." The segment was still live, but Graves looked like a man whose closing argument had ended 5 minutes ago. And the verdict, it wasn't in his hands. It was already being written. One tweet, one whisper, one gut feeling at a time. The studio didn't go silent. It listened. And in that fragile, final stretch of the segment, the audience became the jury. There's a moment after the storm when silence feels less like calm and more like suspense. The studio had gone quiet again, but it was no longer J.D.'s silence that gripped the room. It was hers. From the shadows near the edge of the set, just beyond the reach of the key lights, a figure began to move. At first, only the subtle shuffle of footsteps, software almost hesitant. Then she stepped forward into the frame. Clara Owens. A name the audience didn't know. Yet. But Graves did. The instant he saw her, something in his posture changed. His shoulder dropped an inch. Not visibly to most, but J.D. noticed. So did the host. The cameras, without cue, began to pan. Clara looked smaller than the moment, but only for a second. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, but her back was straight. She wore no makeup, no microphone. Just a calm, deliberate presence, as if she hadn't planned this, but knew she could no longer not speak. Her voice broke the silence. "I was a court aide for Judge Graves for 6 years. No one moved. "I was told not to speak about it. I signed forms. I kept my head down." Her voice shook slightly but didn't falter. "But in August 2021, during the Northwell hearings, he told me to delete 3 meetings from the official calendar." She paused. "Let it settle." "I didn't." A long, breathless silence followed. Not dramatic, reverent. J.D. didn't look surprised. He offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. He had been waiting for her, not pressuring, just trusting, planting seeds of truth in the quiet. waiting for someone else to water them with courage. Graves blinked hard, then leaned forward. "This is a lie," he said, but the words were strangely flat, like a piano key that had lost its sound. Clara looked directly at him now. "I kept copies. I sent one to the oversight committee, and one to a lawyer, just in case." JD didn't interrupt. He didn't need to, because this wasn't his moment. It was hers. The camera caught the host looking off stage, confused. This wasn't planned, not in the rundown, not on the teleprompter. But it didn't matter now. The story had outgrown the script. Clara took a deep breath, then stepped back. Her final words were quiet, but undeniable. "I don't know if it will matter in the end, but at least I finally said it out loud." And with that, she turned, not dramatically, not theatrically, and walked off the set. The studio didn't erupt. It leaned in. JD finally spoke. "Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just showing up." He didn't look at Graves when he said it. He looked into the camera, and somewhere across the country, maybe in a break room, maybe in a veterans clinic, maybe in a small-town diner, someone watching whispered to themselves, "She said it." And that was enough. For now. The air inside the studio didn't move. There was no applause, no cut to commercial, no change in camera angle to reset the mood. Just a long, holding breath, shared by every soul on set and thousands watching live. Clara Owens remained seated now, on a low chair pulled in from behind the backdrop. No studio lights washed her face. She wasn't dressed for broadcast, but she spoke as if the world had finally turned in her direction, and she couldn't afford to look away. "When I first took the job," she began quietly, "I was just happy to be near power." Her hands rested flat on her lap. She didn't read from notes. This wasn't rehearsed. It was recalled, from a part of her memory she tried to bury. "I believed in Judge Graves," she continued. "I believed he stood for something stable, above politics. But then came the Northwell hearings. The room stayed still. Graves sat rigid, eyes forward but unfocused, as if watching something only he could see unravel. "I was asked to omit 3 meetings from the official log," Clara said. "They were with outside counsel. They weren't supposed to happen. I said no, at first." A tremble crept into her voice. She didn't fight it. She let it pass through her. But when the pressure came, I almost gave in. The way he looked at me, like I owed him my silence. That's what loyalty felt like back then." JD didn't speak. He just listened, arms folded, gaze steady. This wasn't his spotlight. It was Clara's confession, but also her absolution. "I filed an internal complaint. Quietly. I didn't tell anyone. Not even my father, who always said truth matters more than your job." She smiled faintly at that. Then her smile faded. The complaint disappeared. Weeks later, I was told I'd been reassigned to digital archiving. That's when I resigned. The host tried to interject, but her voice cut through, unshaken now. "I didn't come here to destroy anyone, but for 3 years I've carried this weight. I told myself if the moment ever came, if someone stood up first, I would follow." She looked at JD. He nodded once. Not approval, just recognition. "Today," she said, "that moment came." The camera zoomed out slowly, not to dramatize, but to allow space, to let the silence speak too. Graves finally leaned forward. "She's a disgruntled employee," he muttered. "This is all political." But his voice no longer carried weight. The authority that once filled rooms now echoed thinly, defensively, and no one echoed him. Clara stood, slow and certain, her voice softer now, but firmer than ever. "This isn't politics. It's remembering who I was before the fear." No music swelled, no dramatic cue. She simply walked off the set, the same way she came, quietly, alone, but no longer invisible. JD turned back toward the judge. He didn't smile. He didn't press. He simply said, "Sometimes truth waits for the silence to clear." And this time Graves said nothing, because deep down he knew. Loyalty ends, but truth begins. Judge Milton Graves had once been called the steel spine of the circuit, but steel doesn't flinch. And in this moment, Graves did. It started small, almost imperceptible. A twitch near the corner of his left eye, a slight repositioning of his hands beneath the table, as though the surface itself had grown too hot. His lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. The mask had cracked. J.D. Vance didn't rush in. He sat calmly, watching, not with triumph, but with clarity, as if he'd expected this moment, not as a possibility, but as a certainty time had simply been waiting to deliver. The cameras didn't blink. Neither did the audience at home. The silence was dense, not awkward, not staged, but sacred in its weight. "Judge," J.D. began, his voice even, not raised, "you've sat in judgment for 3 decades. You've sentenced men and women with a stare. You've been called the moral anchor of the bench." He leaned slightly forward, not aggressively, but as one might when lowering a flag with respect. "But what do we call this?" J.D. opened the black folder fully for the first time. Inside was a third document, time-stamped emails, internal correspondence from 2021 between Graves and a law clerk, one who had since left the judiciary altogether. The subject line was simple: Northwell Memo Clarification. J.D. turned it toward the camera. Judge Graves requested that language in the ruling be toned down and that any mention of the related trust be scrubbed from the record. His exact words: "We don't want speculation to cloud a clean decision." The screen behind them, meant for graphics and logos, now displayed a close-up of the email in full. There were no denials from Graves, not anymore. His mouth twitched again, then settled into a line that didn't mask anything. Not power, not certainty, only fatigue. His shoulders slumped slightly, a posture unseen in every courtroom photo ever taken of him. "This isn't just misconduct," J.D. continued, the weight in his tone now unmistakable. "It's betrayal of the bench, of the law, of the people." The host said nothing. She knew this wasn't her moment. Across the studio, a light operator slowly dimmed one of the side fills, an unconscious reflex, almost as if lowering stage lights at the close of an act. Graves finally spoke. It was not loud, not defiant, but unmistakably human. "I thought I was protecting the court," he said softly. It wasn't an admission of guilt, but it wasn't a denial either. "And when did protecting the court become hiding the truth?" J.D. asked, voice low. Graves didn't answer. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, not as a man bracing for impact, but as someone trying to feel something solid under his skin. He looked up, not at J.D., not at the camera, but somewhere in the distance, where memory turns into regret. "They told me it was routine," he whispered. "Who's they?" J.D. asked, but not harshly. Graves closed his eyes. "You won't find their names in that folder." J.D. nodded once, slowly. He already knew that. A long moment passed, unbroken, sacred. And for the first time in his long and ironclad career, Milton Graves no longer looked like a judge. He looked like a man, tired, cornered, and perhaps quietly relieved that the pretending was over. As the studio dimmed just a touch more, J.D. closed the folder gently. Some truths are too heavy to shout, and some justice doesn't look like punishment. Sometimes it just looks like the end of a lie. The studio had once been cold, controlled, silent. Now it pulsed, not with noise, but with tension so thick it became almost audible. Judge Milton Graves sat hunched forward, hands clasped as if in prayer, but eyes darting, searching for a door that didn't exist. "This is a media ambush," he muttered, mostly to himself. It was the first time he sounded like a man trying to believe what he was saying. The words fell flat, landing with the weight of an excuse too old to stand on its own. J.D. Vance didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed the final page from the folder onto the table. Quiet, smooth, deliberate. "I was hoping you'd say that," J.D. said softly. The camera cut to a close-up. The document was plain, a standard financial disclosure sheet, except this one came from an SEC audit, stamped and time-stamped. It listed a $1.2 million advisory payment to an offshore entity with a single registered consultant, Milton A. Graves. The listed service? Judicial Insight Strategy Notes. JD didn't read it aloud. He didn't have to. The studio's silence cracked, not with words but with breath. A collective inhale, sharp and communal. Not the sound of surprise but of confirmation. For days, months, some would say years, people had suspected the myth, that the robe was not as clean as it seemed, that justice in the hands of the powerful had long ago begun bending toward convenience. But no one expected to watch the myth collapse in real time. The host, a seasoned political analyst and no stranger to televised chaos, looked to her producer through the glass booth. A hand signal came down. Keep rolling. No breaks. No edits. Graves shifted in his chair. The composure that had cracked earlier now fractured completely. He rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers, as though trying to wipe the image away. JD spoke again, calm and surgical. You ruled in favor of Northwell Finance 3 weeks after this payment cleared. Your own firm, Graves and Delaney, closed their Cayman branch 6 days later. A brief pause. Do you still think this is a media ambush, Judge? Or is it a mirror? Graves opened his mouth, closed it, swallowed. And then he said the only sentence that didn't require rehearsing. I should have left the bench 2 years ago. JD didn't smile. He didn't lean in. He simply nodded. Once. That was all. The host leaned forward carefully. Judge Graves, are you acknowledging misconduct? But Graves didn't answer. Not directly. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Cream-colored, sealed. He slid it across the table to JD without a word. JD looked at it but didn't touch it. He didn't need to. Graves finally met his eyes, and in that glance was something ancient. Not guilt, not shame, resignation. Some things outlive power, JD said quietly. Truth is one of them. Graves looked down. So is memory, he whispered. Behind the scenes, phones buzzed. Social feeds exploded. Hashtag Truth Under Lights surged to over 2 million tweets in 20 minutes. But inside the studio, the moment was still. No shouting, no grand verdict. Just a folder, a paper trail, a broken man in a tailored suit. And the unshakable truth. The collapse didn't come with sirens. It came with receipts. The envelope still sat untouched on the glass table. JD didn't move. He let the moment breathe, let the nation sit with the weight of what it had just witnessed. There had been no gavel, no jury, but somehow the verdict had already echoed. Then came the sound of a studio door opening. 2 figures entered, moving not with urgency but with certainty. Black suits, DOJ badges. Neither one said a word at first. They approached with quiet authority, like a pair of shadows called forward by truth. One of them, an older man with steel gray hair and a notepad tucked under his arm, finally spoke. His voice was respectful, but unmistakable in its clarity. Judge Graves, you'll need to come with us. No cuffs, no spotlight, no drama. Graves didn't resist. He didn't even speak. He simply rose from his chair, slowly as though his bones were heavier now, and nodded. He smoothed the front of his jacket, straightened his tie, and for the first time since the show began, looked at the host. Not as an adversary, not even as a witness, but as a person. He gave her the briefest nod, a silent farewell that carried more sorrow than arrogance. JD stood as well, not in mockery, not in triumph. He stood because the moment demanded witness, not applause. The agents flanked Graves on either side but never touched him. No force was needed. Some exits are heavier when taken voluntarily. Their footsteps echoed softly across the studio floor. Not rushed, not ashamed, just final. And in that sound, those soft, deliberate steps, was something more jarring than sirens. Because America wasn't watching a chase. It was watching accountability walk itself out the door. One camera continued rolling. The nation didn't blink. The host finally exhaled. It was the first real breath she'd taken in minutes. She turned toward JD, words forming, but not quite arriving. Before she could speak, JD reached down and picked up the cream envelope. He didn't open it. Instead, he looked into the lens, into the homes of millions, and said simply, "Justice doesn't always knock. Sometimes it waits." And then he stepped away from the table. Behind him, Graves and the agents disappeared down a side corridor. No applause followed, no headlines yet scrolled. But something had changed. A judge had been sentenced, not by the court, not by Congress, but by truth. And the country had watched it happen, in real time. JD remained in his chair long after the footsteps had faded. The lights above no longer felt accusatory, only honest. No one spoke. The crew didn't move. The host stared, unsure whether the segment had ended or just changed its meaning entirely. But JD knew the camera was still live. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't lean forward. He didn't shift his weight to find the most flattering angle. He simply sat squarely in the center of a moment that wasn't about him. He looked into the lens, not through it, not past it, but into it, as if he wasn't speaking to a machine, but to every person sitting at home, on a couch, at a kitchen table, alone in a parked car holding their breath. And then he said, "This wasn't about bringing him down. It was about lifting the truth back up." He didn't blink. "I didn't come here to fight. I came here because there are too many Americans who don't get justice until it's too late, and too many who've never had the microphone." He held the envelope lightly in one hand, not to wave it like a trophy, but to remind the country that evidence had always been there, just waiting for someone to stop pretending it wasn't. This, he gestured softly toward the empty chair where Graves had been, this isn't the end of a man's career. It's the end of a lie. The studio was silent. Even the lights seemed to dim slightly, as if acknowledging the weight of what had just happened. JD's voice dropped, lower, almost like a confession meant only for those who truly listened. "You don't celebrate this. You don't cheer when the system finally flinches. You don't clap for someone doing what they should have done a long time ago." He paused, then added, "I didn't stand for applause. I stood because silence had become too loud." The host finally stirred, her voice almost a whisper. "Senator, what now?" JD turned to her. "Now? We stop acting surprised when the truth shows up." Then he stood, not in triumph, not for attention. He stood like a man leaving a courtroom, not because the case was over, but because it had finally begun. He handed the envelope to the producer quietly and walked off set without waiting for a cue. There were no exit lines, no signature smiles, no sound bites rehearsed for post-show headlines. Just the truth, left behind like a stone in still water. And the ripples had only just begun. It began with a plain envelope, no stamp, no return address. Just a postmark from somewhere in Indiana, and a name written in careful, shaking ink, to J.D. Vance. His staff almost tossed it in with the usual stack of policy appeals, budget briefs, and angry circulars. But something about its weight, too light for an agenda, too heavy for junk, made Maggie the intern pause. She opened it at the corner of her desk, expecting a request. Instead, she found just a folded piece of paper. No date, no signature. Just 12 handwritten words. "I said no today for the first time in 11 years. Thank you." She stared at the words for a long time, then walked it into JD's office without knocking. He was on a call, but he ended it mid-sentence when he saw her face. No fanfare, no explanation. He read it once, then twice, then set it gently on the desk, as if afraid too much pressure would erase what it had taken over a decade for someone to say out loud. That was Tuesday. By Friday, they had 6 more. A nurse from North Carolina wrote, "I watched the segment in the break room. I've been carrying a sealed folder in my locker for 4 years. Monday, I open it. A high school counselor in Missouri. We were taught not to question the judges, but today I did. Quietly, but I did. An anonymous courthouse janitor in Pennsylvania. I cleaned the office where the files disappeared. I always knew. I just never thought someone else did too." Each letter was different, but they all carried the same note beneath the ink. "Someone saw me." Someone said it out loud. By the end of the week, JD's staff cleared a full shelf in the back of the office and began carefully stacking the envelopes by region. Appalachia, the South, the Rust Belt. They added paper clips and sticky notes to track responses, thinking maybe they were prepping for a public statement. But JD had no interest in turning it into a campaign. Not this. "This isn't strategy," he said to Maggie one morning, holding a new envelope with no name on the front. Just a quote from Isaiah written in cursive. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil. He read every letter, personally, at night, sometimes at his desk, sometimes in the hallway near the wall of district maps, sometimes in the stairwell where the echo softened the sound of his breathing. They came from women and men, young and old, red states, blue states, no states. Some typed, some written by hand, some dictated by trembling fingers. But every one of them had waited for the moment when someone, not perfect, not powerful, just willing, would pull the pin and let the silence bleed out. And now it had. They didn't send applause. They sent testimony. By the second week, the shelf was full, so JD ordered a new one. Not for decoration, but because the truth, once lifted, had found 1,000 quiet voices willing to say, "Me too." It began as a whisper in legal circles, then a phone call from Colorado, then Maine. By the time Friday arrived, 7 state oversight boards had quietly launched judicial integrity reviews. Not performative, not reactive, but real. What happened in that studio wasn't supposed to shift anything. It was supposed to embarrass a man, expose a moment, maybe spark a few headlines. But this was structural. In California, a newly elected attorney general held a closed-door session with his ethics team. Graves wasn't the only one who sat too close to the fire, he reportedly told aides. In Georgia, a grassroots legal watchdog posted, "If D.C. can shine a light, we can at least strike a match." J.D. Vance didn't hold press conferences about it. He didn't tweet about it either. Instead, he made a quiet visit to his archive cabinet, back in Ohio, dusty with age and indifference. Folder after folder, proposals no one had wanted to hear, speeches he never gave. One was labeled in fading black ink, the Judicial Integrity Act, 2019 draft. Back then, no one listened. They told him reforming the judiciary was career suicide. He opened it now like a time capsule, one written before anyone thought he'd ever face down a federal judge, live on air. The draft was idealistic, wordy, maybe even a bit naive, but it was principled. The core of it was simple. Every ruling leaves a trail, and if we never follow it, we shouldn't call it justice. The next day, he flew back to D.C. He handed it to Senator Grace Liu, an independent from Oregon known for her ferocity and fairness. She read it that night on a train ride home, called him the next morning with 2 words, "Let's move." Within a week, it had a title, a sponsor, and a preamble rewritten in firmer, older hands. The bipartisan coalition wasn't flashy, but it was solid. 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans, 1 independent, no cameras, no sound bites, just signatures on paper that had been gathering dust for 4 years. Reporters asked, "Why now?" JD shrugged, "Because now someone's listening." The Judicial Integrity Act called for real-time ruling transparency, third-party financial audits of federal judges, and whistleblower protections for court staff. Provisions JD had once been told were too aggressive. Now they were being called overdue. Clips of the segment played on loop in background B-rolls of the press coverage. But that moment, the folder, the nod, the silence, was no longer the story. The story had shifted from spectacle to statute. Inside committee rooms, junior aides whispered, "That's the bill from the segment, right?" Outside, former court interns emailed talking points. A retired judge from Arizona sent in a letter supporting the act. "I made mistakes in my early years. If this law had existed, I would have made fewer." It wasn't sweeping change. Not yet. But it was motion. Real legislative motion. And in a city addicted to inertia, even a ripple is revolutionary. JD didn't smile when he saw the draft appear on the Senate docket, but he did underline one line in the bill's preamble, the one carried over from his original 2019 draft. "The law is not what we declare it in court. It's what we uphold when no one's watching." He closed the folder, leaned back in his chair, and whispered to himself, "Took them long enough." The spotlight followed J.D. Vance for weeks. Networks called daily, offering prime slots. A special with Anderson Cooper, a Sunday sit-down with CBS. Even late-night hosts offered the serious chair instead of the comic one. But J.D. said no every time. His team gently protested. "You could own the narrative. You're the face of this bill." He just nodded and walked past another camera. Some called it strategy. Others called it fear. But those who knew him best recognized something else entirely: restraint. He hadn't stood in that studio to become a headline. He'd stood to make one disappear. It was a chilly Thursday when he entered Harvard Law's main hall, unannounced. A student-led panel on ethics and transparency had gathered in one of the older lecture rooms. Wood-paneled, dusty with age and ambition. No press, no producers, just students and a single faculty moderator. JD took a seat in the back row. No security detail, no staffers. One student, a young woman in a navy sweater, nudged her classmate. "Is that?" He heard her, smiled faintly, but didn't turn. The moderator called the panel to order. They debated clauses in the Judicial Integrity Act, argued over accountability models, tossed around names like Brandeis, Bork, and Breyer. At one point, a student asked, "But how do we enforce trust in an institution designed to shield itself?" JD didn't raise his hand. He didn't speak. He listened. Near the end, during Q&A, a lanky first-year student stood up. Nervous, he held a crinkled notepad but barely looked at it. "Sorry, but why isn't Senator Vance up there with the panel?" Heads turned, eyes darted. JD didn't flinch. He simply replied, calm and clear, "Because the truth speaks best when no one interrupts it." The room fell still. No applause, just awareness. The moderator smiled, then nodded with something closer to reverence than protocol. Later, as students packed up, several approached him. No selfies, no microphones, just questions that started with, "How did you?" and "Did you know then that?" JD answered a few, but mostly he asked questions back. "What would you have done? What would justice look like if the cameras weren't there?" One student said quietly, "It was never about Graves, was it?" JD met her gaze. It was never just about him. That evening, as he exited through the side gate, a local cameraman, camped there all day, finally spotted him. "Senator, one question? Just one?" JD paused, looked at the camera, then past it. He raised his hand, not in refusal but in acknowledgement, and said, "Tell them to ask better questions." Then he turned and walked into the dusk. The snow outside hadn't melted yet. Thin white patches clung to the corners of the school parking lot like stubborn memories. Inside room 112 of Cedar Hill High in rural Iowa, the radiator hummed a low, uneven rhythm as the civics class settled into their seats. It was Friday, the kind of day that usually slipped by quietly. Pop quizzes, half-attentive glances at the clock, whispers about weekend plans. But today felt different. Their teacher, Mr. Rollins, wasn't holding a quiz. Instead, he stood beside the mounted TV at the front of the class with a small remote in hand and a clipped sentence on the board. "When does truth matter most?" A few students blinked at the words, unsure if this was a debate prompt or a riddle. Then the screen flickered on. The room quieted as the segment began. Footage from the now viral broadcast. JD Vance on set. Judge Graves across from him. The black folder between them. The heavy pause before the first line was ever spoken. Some students sat forward. Others folded their arms. But no one looked away. They watched the moment Clara Owens stepped forward, her voice breaking and then sharpening like a blade finely drawn. They saw the way Graves' expression changed, not in panic, but in surrender. By the time the clip ended, no one moved. It was Ethan, a junior with a baseball cap still on backward, who broke the silence. "How'd he not lose it?" he asked, almost disbelieving. The guy tried to bury him live on air. That judge came for blood. Mr. Rollins looked at him for a moment, then answered not with a lecture, but a line that hung in the air like a slow-turning page. "Because justice is louder when it whispers." A few students glanced around, unsure what that meant. Others nodded, quietly, almost reverently. Mr. Rollins didn't elaborate. He let the words sit. Then he walked to his desk and picked up a folder, blue, worn, no label. He opened it slowly and pulled out a printed copy of JD's forgotten bill, the Judicial Integrity Act. He passed copies around. "This wasn't new," he said. "He wrote this years ago. No one cared then. It was too idealistic, too inconvenient." He paused, scanning their faces. "But sometimes the world needs a scandal just to listen to a truth it's already seen." Kayla, usually the quiet one in the back, raised her hand. So, does it matter that it took all this just to get people to care? Rollins offered a small, tired smile. Sometimes it takes a storm to hear a whisper, but the whisper still mattered. It just needed the right moment. A beat of silence passed before he added, "We study history through revolutions and speeches, but sometimes history turns in a pause, in a person who chose not to shout back." As the bell rang, backpacks zipped and chairs shuffled, but a few lingered, more thoughtful than before. Before they left, Mr. Rollins called out gently, "Monday, we'll talk about whistleblowers. But over the weekend, I want you to think about something." They paused at the door. If it had been you on that stage, would you have whispered or shouted? No one answered right away, but several slowed their steps on the way out. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft, steady, and silent. It appeared overnight. No camera caught the hand that taped it there. No headlines mentioned it. Just a thin wooden post on the corner of First and Benton, outside the very studio where it all happened. Where truth was whispered. Where silence shattered a career more cleanly than any courtroom ruling. The sign was made of cardboard, weather-worn at the edges, like it had waited a long time to be used. The ink bled slightly from the moisture in the air, but the words remained clear. No one is too small to question the robe. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to be. There were no hashtags, no logos, no names signed at the bottom. And yet people began to pause. At first, just a producer arriving early for her shift. She stopped briefly, eyes narrowing, a hand gently brushing the message like checking if it was real. Then a sound technician. Then a janitor. Then 3 interns on their way back from a coffee run. One of them snapped a photo but didn't post it. He just kept it in his gallery, under a folder named "Remember This." By noon, the sidewalk felt quieter than usual. People still moved past, but they walked differently. Slower, as if passing a place of memory, not media. Some looked away, unsure if it was okay to meet those words with their eyes. Others nodded gently, subtly, like a silent agreement with someone they'd never meet. Nobody dared remove the sign. Not security, not building management. Even the studio's legal team, known for overcaution, left it untouched. When someone suggested it was technically graffiti, a receptionist quietly replied, "So was the Declaration once." Across the street, inside a modest sandwich shop, 2 middle-aged veterans ate in silence. One of them, gray-bearded and soft-spoken, set down his cup and gestured out the window toward the sign. "That's the first time I've seen the bench feel human," he said. "Not high above us, just reachable." His friend nodded. "Feels like we were in the room, like someone finally said what we'd carried for years." By late afternoon, more began to come. Not in protest, but in pilgrimage. A nurse in scrubs paused long enough to whisper something under her breath before walking away. A former clerk left a yellow rose beneath the post. An older woman held her granddaughter's hand as they stopped in front of it. The girl asked what the words meant. The woman replied softly, "It means truth doesn't care how important someone looks. It just waits to be spoken." Dusk rolled in gently, the city's glow bleeding into the sidewalk, the air cooling with the promise of night. But the sign remained, untouched, unclaimed, and yet somehow belonging to everyone who had once felt too small to speak. A journalist walked by near closing hours, his press badge still around his neck. He read the words once, twice, then typed them into his notes app, not for an article, but for himself, for something he hadn't written in years, a personal journal entry. Inside the studio, the lights were being dimmed, the stage cleaned, another story ready to replace the one that had shaken the nation. But outside, the post stood still. One piece of cardboard, 7 words, a reminder carved not in stone, but in courage. JD walked alone, the weight of the day trailing behind him like the long shadow of an old truth finally let loose. The sun had begun its slow descent over the hill, casting a golden hue over the quiet Washington street. No reporters followed, no cameras clicked, just the soft crunch of autumn leaves beneath his shoes and the wind tugging gently at the lapel of his coat. He passed the same wrought iron fence he'd walked by so many times in silence. When he was younger, unproven, full of questions. But this time, something was different. Not louder, just clearer. The kind of clarity that settles in the air after a storm has passed and no one quite knows what to say yet. The hill led down to a narrow path flanked by old trees. They shed their leaves without apology, littering the stone walkway with the colors of endings. Amber, rust, fading gold. JD didn't rush. He let the stillness guide him. With each step, it became less about what had happened in that studio and more about what might begin afterward. He reached an unassuming building, old with its paint slightly chipped at the corners. A door, nothing special. No brass placard, no polished marble, just a door. One that had always been there. One that, for far too long, no one had thought to watch. He paused, and then with the quiet conviction of someone who had nothing to prove anymore, he opened it. No announcement, no security detail, no waiting staff to usher him in, just silence. He stepped inside and gently closed the door behind him. The click of the latch echoed through the small corridor. Not sharp, not grand, just final. And outside, the wind picked up a little, scattering a few leaves across the steps he'd just climbed. A few people passed by on the street below, unaware of the moment that had just folded into history. Inside the building, there was no applause, no welcome party, just the hum of quiet systems at rest, and somewhere nearby, the low murmur of someone typing, working late. Life went on, but something had shifted, and as JD moved further down the hallway, his footsteps steady and deliberate, a voice, his own, echoed not from his mouth, but from somewhere deeper, where purpose lives. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with sirens. Sometimes it walks in. Through the door, no one bothered guarding anymore. The door didn't need to slam shut. It didn't need to make noise. Its closing wasn't an ending. It was a continuation of a truth finally walked into daylight, and for once there was no need to speak louder to be heard. The stillness was enough. There's something quietly powerful about how this story ends, not in noise or triumph, but in the stillness of a man who chose truth over spectacle. J.D. Vance didn't chase applause. He didn't need a gavel to demand accountability. He simply walked into a space most people forgot needed guarding and stood still long enough for the truth to speak for itself. This chapter reminds us that justice isn't always about dramatic takedowns or thunderous endings. Sometimes it's about presence, about doing what's right when no one is cheering, when no one's even watching. The quiet footsteps down that hallway echo something deeper. Integrity is measured not in what you expose, but in what you choose to uphold after the cameras stop rolling. And in a time when noise often drowns out nuance, it's a powerful reminder that dignity still matters, that courage can look like calm, that the most radical thing you can do is tell the truth and then walk away without needing to be celebrated. What would it look like in your life to stand for something, even if no one noticed right away? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.